The woman collapsed in the dust 3 miles from Iron Creek Ranch with a dying horse and no water left. She'd been running from grief for 2 years, but the New Mexico desert doesn't care about your past. It only cares if you're strong enough to survive the next hour. What she found at the end of that cottonwood line wasn't just water. It was a quiet rancher who'd learned to read loneliness in a stranger's eyes, and a choice that would define the rest of her life. This is the story of Lenora Hale and the spring that never ran dry. Watch until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The horse stumbled again, and this time Lenora Hale knew it wouldn't get back up if she let it fall. "Come on," she whispered, pulling the reins tighter, keeping the mare's head elevated through sheer force of will. Just a little further. The animal's flanks heaved, foam crusted white around the bit. Lenora's own throat felt like cracked leather, her lips split and bleeding from 3 days of rationing water that ran out yesterday morning. The sun hammered down on the high desert of New Mexico territory with the kind of heat that didn't just make you sweat. It cooked the moisture right out of your skin until you felt like something left too long in an oven. She'd lost the main road 2 days back, maybe longer. Time got strange when you were this thirsty, this tired, this alone. The satchel across her shoulder, worn leather with her mother's initials still faintly visible, bumped against her ribs with every step. Inside were sketches her mother had made before the fever took her in St. Louis, drawings of mountains and valleys the woman had never seen but had somehow known how to imagine. Lenora kept them because they were all she had left of a life that used to include people who knew her name. Her father had died 2 years before her mother. A stupid accident with a loaded wagon and a spooked mule team. After that, it was just the two of them in a boarding house that smelled like cabbage and coal smoke, her mother coughing into handkerchiefs that came away spotted with red, Lenora working as a seamstress and bringing home barely enough to keep them fed. When her mother died, Lenora found she didn't have the strength to stay in that room anymore. She sold what little they owned, bought a horse and a saddle, and started moving west with some half-formed idea about finding work in Santa Fe. Someone had told her they needed teachers there. Or maybe it was cooks. She couldn't remember now. That was 6 months ago. She'd passed through Kansas, touched the edge of Colorado, drifted down through Raton Pass into New Mexico. She'd worked in a hotel kitchen in Las Vegas for 5 weeks until the owner's son got too friendly and she had to leave in the middle of the night. She'd mucked stalls in a freight depot outside Fort Union until the pay stopped coming and the man running it disappeared with what he owed her. She'd sewn dresses for a dry goods store in a town whose name she'd already forgotten. Every place was temporary. Every job ended. Every time she thought she might stay, something happened that reminded her she was just passing through. And now she was going to die 3 miles from a ranch she couldn't see, on land that didn't care whether she lived or fell. The horse stopped walking. Lenora pulled on the reins. No, not yet. The mare's legs trembled. Her head drooped low, too low, and Lenora felt the animal's weight shift in a way that meant it was done. Finished. It had given everything it had, and there was nothing left. "Please," Lenora said, and hated how her voice cracked on the word. The horse's front legs buckled. Lenora barely managed to pull her boot from the stirrup before the mare went down on her knees, then rolled sideways into the dust. The animal's breath came in rapid, shallow gasps. Its eyes were glassy and unfocused. Lenora knelt beside the horse and put her hand on its neck. The mare's coat was hot and dry, the heartbeat beneath too fast, too weak. She'd pushed this animal past what it could survive, and now it was paying the price for her desperation. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The horse didn't respond. Its breathing slowed, steadied, stopped. Lenora sat back on her heels and stared at the body for a long time. She should feel something more than exhaustion. Grief, maybe. Guilt. But she'd used up most of her emotions somewhere between St. Louis and here, and what was left didn't have the energy for mourning a horse she'd only owned for 6 months. She stood slowly, every muscle protesting. Her legs shook, her vision blurred at the edges. She pulled the satchel off the saddle, slung it over her shoulder, and started walking in the direction she thought might lead to water. The sun climbed higher. Her shadow shortened to almost nothing. She counted steps for a while, 100, 200, but lost track somewhere after 500 and gave up. The landscape didn't change. Scrub brush and red dirt and distant mesas that shimmered in the heat like they were painted on glass. No trees, no green, no sign that anything lived out here except her, and she wasn't sure how much longer that would be true. Her boot caught on a rock and she went down hard, palms scraping across gravel. She stayed there on her hands and knees, breathing dust, and thought about how easy it would be to just lie down and wait for the heat to finish what it started. But her mother's satchel pressed against her side, and she thought about the drawings inside. Mountains her mother never climbed, rivers she never crossed, dreams she'd had about places she'd never reach. Lenora pushed herself up and kept walking. That's when she saw the cottonwoods. At first she thought it was a mirage, her mind conjuring what her body needed most. But she blinked hard, wiped the grit from her eyes, and the trees were still there. A dark green line cutting across the pale desert about a mile ahead, maybe less. Trees meant water. Water meant life. She walked faster, then stumbled into a run that was more like a controlled fall forward. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her vision tunneled until all she could see was that line of green getting closer, closer. She tripped over a half-buried stone and went sprawling again, this time sliding several feet through loose dirt before she stopped. She lay there for a moment, tasting blood from where she'd bitten her tongue, then hauled herself up and kept going. The cottonwoods resolved into individual trees as she got closer, tall and full-crowned, their leaves rustling in a breeze she couldn't feel yet. She could hear water now, the unmistakable sound of a spring or a creek running over stones. She broke through the last stretch of open ground and stumbled into the shade beneath the trees. The temperature dropped 20 degrees. The air tasted wet and green and alive. The spring bubbled up from between two flat rocks and spread into a shallow creek that ran north through a narrow channel lined with grass and wildflowers. Lenora dropped to her knees at the edge, plunged her hands into the water, cold, shockingly cold, and brought them to her mouth. She drank until her stomach cramped, splashed water over her face and neck, dunked her whole head under, and came up gasping, water streaming from her hair, and for the first time in days she felt like maybe she wouldn't die today after all. She sat back on the bank and looked around. Upstream, maybe 200 yards away, she could see a ranch house, low-built and weathered, with a porch that wrapped around the front and one side. Beyond it were a barn, a corral, and several smaller outbuildings. Cattle grazed in a pasture to the east. Chickens scratched in the dirt near what looked like a vegetable garden. Someone lived here. Someone had built a life on this hard land, right next to the only water for miles. Lenora knew she should get up and walk to the house, knock on the door, ask permission to be here. But her legs wouldn't cooperate. She sat by the creek and watched the water flow past, clear and steady, and tried to remember the last time she'd felt this tired. "That's private water." The voice came from behind her, quiet and level. Not angry, but not welcoming either. Lenora turned slowly, her heart suddenly pounding. A man stood about 10 feet away holding a rifle loosely in both hands, not pointing it at her, but not exactly holding it casual either. He was tall and lean, probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair and darker eyes that didn't miss much. His clothes were worn but clean. A work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, canvas pants, boots that had been resoled more than once. His face was sun-darkened and carved with lines that came from squinting into hard weather for too many years. "I'm sorry," Lenora said. Her voice came out hoarse and cracked. "I didn't know. My horse died about 3 miles back. I ran out of water yesterday." The man studied her for a long moment. His gaze took in her dusty clothes, her split lips, the way her hands shook even though she was trying to hold them still. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Santa Fe, maybe. I'm not sure anymore." "That's 60 miles northwest." "I know. I got turned around." He lowered the rifle slightly. "You drink enough?" "I think so." "You'll want to drink more. Slow, though. Too fast and you'll just throw it back up." Lenora nodded and turned back to the creek, cupping another handful of water to her mouth. She drank slower this time, letting her body adjust. "What's your name?" the man asked. "Lenora Hale." "I'm Caleb Mercer. This is Iron Creek Ranch." She turned to look at him again. "I'm grateful for the water. I'll move on as soon as I can stand without falling over." Caleb's expression didn't change. "You got supplies? Food?" "Some hardtack, a little dried beef." "That all?" "That's all." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes still measuring her, trying to decide something she couldn't read. Then he said, "Come up to the house. You can get some real food and rest out of the sun. As long as the spring runs, you're welcome here." Lenora blinked. "You don't know me." "No, but I know what it looks like when someone's got nowhere else to go." He turned and started walking toward the ranch house without waiting to see if she'd follow. After a moment, Lenora pushed herself to her feet, legs still shaking, head still light, and went after him. Keats. The inside of the house was cooler than it had any right to be. Thick adobe walls, small windows shuttered against the heat, and a cross breeze that moved through the rooms like something engineered instead of accidental. The main room held a wood stove, a rough-hewn table with 4 mismatched chairs, and a few shelves lined with canned goods and sacks of flour and beans. Everything was clean but worn, used hard and cared for. Caleb pointed to one of the chairs. "Sit." Lenora sat. Her legs were grateful. He moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who'd been cooking for himself for a long time. He pulled a pot from a hook, filled it with water from a pitcher, and set it on the stove. Added dried beans and some kind of cured meat from a jar. Sliced bread from a loaf wrapped in cloth and set it on a plate in front of her with a crock of butter. "Eat that while the beans heat up," he said. Lenora picked up the bread. Her hands were still shaking. She buttered a slice and took a bite, and it tasted like the best thing she'd eaten in months. She finished the first slice and started on a second before she realized Caleb was watching her. "Sorry," she said. "I haven't eaten much in the last few days." "I can tell." A door opened on the far side of the room, and another man walked in, shorter than Caleb, stockier, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that came from smiling more than squinting. He stopped when he saw Lenora, glanced at Caleb, then back at her. "We got company?" he asked. "Lenora Hale," Caleb said. "This is Rafael Ortega. He runs the ranch with me." Rafael nodded to her. "You look like you had a rough ride." "My horse didn't make it," Lenora said quietly. Rafael's expression softened. "I'm sorry, that's a hard thing." "It happens," Lenora said, though she didn't quite believe it. Rafael crossed to the stove and sniffed the pot of beans. "You feeding her the leftovers from yesterday?" "It's what we got. I can make something better than that." Rafael nudged Caleb aside and started pulling more ingredients from the shelves: onions, peppers, a tin of tomatoes. "You like spice?" he asked Lenora. "I like food," she said. Rafael grinned. "Good answer." Caleb leaned against the counter and watched Rafael work. And Lenora got the sense that this was a routine they'd done 1,000 times. The comfortable silence of people who'd worked together long enough that words were optional. "How long you been running this place?" Lenora asked. 10 years, Caleb said. Rafael's been here 8. "You built it from nothing?" "More or less. The spring was here, the land was cheap. Nobody else wanted it." "Why not?" "Too dry, too remote, too hard to make anything work." He paused. "But the spring never stops running, even in the worst droughts. So we made it work." Rafael ladled beans and meat and vegetables into a bowl and set it in front of Lenora with a spoon. "Eat slow. You'll make yourself sick otherwise." She ate slowly, forcing herself to pause between bites, even though her body wanted to inhale everything on the table. The food was simple but good, the kind of cooking that came from practice and necessity instead of recipes. Rafael and Caleb sat across from her and ate their own bowls without talking much, and Lenora found the silence oddly comforting. No questions about where she'd been or where she was going. No judgment about showing up half dead and desperate. When she finished, Rafael took her bowl and refilled it without asking if she wanted more. She ate the second bowl slower than the first, and by the time she was done, she felt almost human again. "Thank you," she said. Rafael nodded. "You need a place to sleep tonight?" "I don't want to impose." "You already imposed by drinking our water," Caleb said, but there was something almost like humor in his voice. "Might as well impose a little more." "We got a spare room," Rafael added. "Nothing fancy, but it's got a bed and a door that closes." Lenora hesitated. She'd learned to be careful about accepting help from strangers, especially men, but her body was too tired to walk another mile, and something about the way Caleb and Rafael moved around each other, easy and unbothered, made her think they weren't the kind of men who'd cause her trouble. "Just for one night," she said. "Sure," Caleb said. "Just one night." The room was small and plain, a narrow bed with a quilt that had been mended more than once, a wooden chair, and a window that looked out toward the cottonwoods and the creek. Lenora set her satchel on the chair and sat on the edge of the bed, and the mattress felt like the finest thing she'd ever touched. She lay back and closed her eyes, just for a moment, and didn't wake up until morning. Sets. When she opened her eyes, sunlight was streaming through the window and she could hear voices outside. She sat up slowly, her muscles stiff and sore from days of hard riding and harder walking. Her mouth tasted like dust and her hair felt like straw, but she was alive and rested, and that was more than she'd expected yesterday. She stood and looked out the window. Caleb and Raphael were working in the corral, fixing a section of fence that had come loose. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this work so many times they didn't need to talk about it. Raphael held the post steady while Caleb hammered. When the post was secure, they moved to the next one without pausing. Lenora found a basin of water on a stand near the door. Someone must have left it while she was sleeping, and washed her face and hands. Her reflection in the small mirror on the wall showed a woman who looked older than 26, hollow-eyed and sun-worn, with lines starting to etch themselves around her mouth and across her forehead. She looked like someone who'd been running for a long time. She braided her hair, straightened her clothes as best she could, and went outside. Raphael saw her first and waved. "Morning. You sleep all right?" "Better than I have in months," Lenora admitted. "Good. There's coffee in the house if you want it. Beans from breakfast, too." Lenora went inside and poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. It was strong and bitter and exactly what she needed. She stood by the window and drank it while watching Caleb and Raphael finish the fence repairs. When they came in, Caleb nodded to her. "You planning to head out today?" "I should," Lenora said. "I've already taken too much of your hospitality." "You're not taking anything we can't spare." He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. "How far are you planning to walk?" "As far as I need to." "That's not a plan." "It's the only one I've got." Caleb studied her over the rim of his cup. "You got money for a new horse?" Lenora's silence was answer enough. "Then you're not walking to Santa Fe," he said. "You'll die before you make it 20 miles. "I've made it this far." "Barely." She wanted to argue, but she couldn't. He was right. She had no horse, almost no supplies, and no clear idea of how to survive the next leg of the journey. "What do you suggest?" she asked finally. "Stay here a few more days, get your strength back. We could use an extra hand around the place, and Raphael's been complaining about doing all the cooking." "Hey," Raphael protested mildly. "You got experience with ranch work?" Caleb asked. Some, Lenora said. "I've done a little of everything the last few years, cooking, cleaning, mending, mucking stalls. I'm not afraid of hard work." "Good, because that's all we got here." Lenora looked between the two men. "Why are you helping me?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Because someone helped me once when I needed it. And because this land's got enough ghosts already. I'd rather not add yours to the list." It wasn't a sentimental answer. It was practical and blunt and honest, and somehow that made it easier to accept. "All right," Lenora said. "A few days, then I'll figure out what's next." "Fair enough," Caleb said. Raphael grinned. "Welcome to Iron Creek, Chates." The work started immediately. Caleb and Raphael didn't believe in easing someone into ranch life. By mid-morning, Lenora was hauling water from the spring to the vegetable garden, pulling weeds from between rows of squash and beans, and learning the hard way that chickens were meaner than they looked. "Don't let them intimidate you," Raphael called from the barn door as Lenora backed away from a particularly aggressive hen. "You're bigger than they are." "Tell that to the chicken," Lenora muttered. But she went back and collected the eggs anyway, ignoring the indignant squawking and the occasional peck at her hands. By the time she brought the basket to the house, she had a dozen eggs and a new respect for anyone who dealt with poultry for a living. Lunch was more beans, this time with cornbread Raphael made in a cast-iron skillet, and then it was back to work. Caleb showed her how to check the fences for damage, how to spot weak posts that needed replacing, how to read the land for signs of cattle wandering too far from water. He didn't talk much while they worked, but when he did speak, it was to teach her something useful. "See those tracks?" he said, pointing to marks in the dirt near the creek. "Coyotes. They come down at night for water. Long as they don't bother the cattle, we leave them alone." "What if they do bother the cattle?" "Then we deal with it. But most predators out here are just trying to survive, same as us. No point killing something unless it's a real threat." They walked the fence line for another hour, and Lenora found herself watching the way Caleb moved through the landscape, slow and deliberate, noticing everything. Where she saw empty desert, he saw water sources, animal trails, weather patterns written in the clouds. He read the land the way some people read books. "You learned all this yourself?" she asked. "Some of it. The rest I learned from people who were willing to teach." He glanced at her. "You learn fast. That's good. Out here, you don't get a lot of second chances to figure things out." By the time they got back to the house, the sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, and Lenora's legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Raphael had dinner ready. This time, it was venison stew with vegetables from the garden, and they ate while the light faded outside. "You did good today," Raphael said. "Most people from back east would have quit after the first hour." "I'm not from back east anymore," Lenora said quietly. "No," Caleb agreed. "I guess you're not." The few days stretched into a week, then two. Lenora told herself she was just getting her strength back, just earning enough to buy supplies for the next leg of the journey. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit. She didn't want to leave. For the first time in years, she woke up knowing what her day would hold. There was work to do, always work, but it was work that mattered. When she mended a fence, it stayed mended. When she cooked a meal, people ate it and thanked her. When she hauled water to the garden, the plants grew. It was a small life, but it was real. And slowly, she started to feel real again too. She learned that Raphael had come north from Mexico 8 years ago, looking for work and a place where his past didn't follow him. He never talked about what that past included, and neither Caleb nor Lenora asked. Some stories were meant to stay buried. She learned that Caleb had built the ranch from nothing after spending years drifting through the territory doing whatever work he could find. He'd saved every penny, bought the land when nobody else wanted it, and spent a decade proving that survival wasn't just possible, it was inevitable if you were stubborn enough. "Why here?" she asked him one evening while they sat on the porch watching the stars come out. "The spring," he said simply. "Everything else out here dies when the drought comes. But that spring, it never stops. I figured if I built around water that wouldn't quit, I could make something that would last. Has it been worth it?" He was quiet for a long time. "Ask me again in another 10 years. The days developed a rhythm. Morning chores before the heat got too bad. Midday work in the shade when possible. Evening repairs and planning for the next day. And at night, after dinner, Lenora started writing. She'd found an old notebook in her satchel, one her mother had used for sketching but never filled. Lenora had been carrying it for months without touching it, but something about Iron Creek made her want to put words on paper again. She wrote about the ranch, about the spring and the cottonwoods and the way the desert looked when the sun rose, about Raphael teaching her to make tortillas and Caleb showing her how to read the sky for rain, about the silence that wasn't empty but full of wind and birdsong and the distant lowing of cattle. She wrote about survival, about what it meant to build something in a place that didn't want you to succeed, about the quiet strength of men who didn't talk much but showed up every morning to do the work anyway. One evening, Raphael found her writing at the kitchen table while Caleb was out checking the cattle. "What are you working on?" he asked. "Nothing important, just thoughts." "Can I read it?" Lenora hesitated, then slid the notebook across the table. Raphael read for a few minutes, his expression serious, then looked up. "This is good," he said. "Really good. You should write more." "I don't know what else to write about." "Write about the people out here. The ones nobody talks about. The ones who keep going even when everything's trying to stop them." He paused. "Write about the truth." Lenora took the notebook back and looked at the pages. Maybe he was right. Maybe there were stories out here worth telling. She started writing more. Short pieces about ranchers and drifters and women running boarding houses in towns with no names. She wrote about drought and hardship and the small victories that kept people moving forward. She didn't show the pieces to anyone except Raphael, who read everything and always told her to keep going. "You got a voice," he said one night. "Not the fancy kind that comes from school, the real kind that comes from living. Don't waste it." Well, 3 weeks after Lenore arrived, a rider came down from the north with news that made Caleb's jaw tighten. The drought was getting worse. Wells were drying up across the territory. Cattle were dying. Ranchers were selling land to speculators from back east, men with money and no understanding of what it took to survive out here. They're buying up everything they can, the writer said, offering prices that sound good until you realize they're just going to strip the land bare and move on. They come by here yet? Caleb asked. Not yet, but they will. Everyone knows Iron Creek's got the best water in 50 miles. After the writer left, Caleb stood on the porch for a long time, staring out at the creek. Lenora came and stood beside him. What are you going to do? She asked. Same thing I've always done. Keep working. Keep building. Keep the spring running. What if they try to force you out? Then I'll deal with it when it happens. He looked at her. You planning to stick around for that? Lenore realized she'd been thinking about staying even before he asked. She'd been thinking about it every morning when she woke up and every night when she went to sleep. She'd been thinking about it while she worked and while she wrote and while she sat on this porch watching the sun go down. Yeah, she said quietly, I think I am. Caleb nodded once, like that settled something, and went back inside. Lenora stayed on the porch and looked out at the cottonwoods and the creek flowing steady beneath them. She'd spent 2 years running from the places that hurt her, convinced that the next town or the next job would somehow be different. But maybe the answer wasn't finding a place that didn't hurt. Maybe it was finding a place worth staying for even when it did. She touched the satchel at her side, her mother's drawing still safe inside, and thought about all the mountains and rivers her mother had imagined but never reached. Maybe this was far enough. Maybe this was where the journey ended and something else began. She went inside and started writing. The first storm came in late September, rolling across the desert like something alive and angry. Lenora saw it building in the west while she was hauling feed to the barn, dark clouds stacked high and moving fast, lightning threading through them in jagged lines that made her think of broken glass. Raphael? She called toward the house. Storm coming. He came out and looked at the sky, then immediately started moving. Get the chickens inside, I'll help Caleb with the cattle. Lenora ran to the coop and started herding birds toward the enclosed run, cursing when they scattered in every direction except the one she wanted. By the time she got the last hen inside and latched the door, the wind had picked up enough to throw dust in her eyes and make the cottonwoods bend sideways. She ran for the house just as the first raindrops hit, fat and heavy, striking the ground hard enough to kick up little clouds of dust. She made it through the door as the sky opened up completely, rain coming down in sheets so thick she couldn't see the barn anymore. Caleb and Raphael came in soaking wet a few minutes later, their boots leaving muddy tracks across the floor. Caleb went straight to the window and stood there watching the storm tear across the ranch. How bad is it? Lenora asked. Could be worse, could be better. He didn't take his eyes off the window. Depends on how long it lasts. The storm lasted 3 hours. Rain hammered the roof and turned the yard into a shallow lake. Thunder shook the walls, and then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The clouds broke apart, and evening sunlight poured through, turning everything gold and wet. They went outside to check the damage. 2 sections of fence were down. Part of the chicken coop roof had blown off. The vegetable garden was flattened, most of the plants beaten into the mud. But the cattle were accounted for, the barn was intact, and the spring was still running clear and steady. We got lucky, Raphael said, surveying the wreckage. Lucky would have been no storm at all, Caleb muttered, already moving toward the downed fence with a hammer and a sack of nails. They worked until dark repairing what could be fixed immediately, and by the time they came in for dinner, everyone was too tired to talk much. Lenora made beans and cornbread while Raphael cleaned mud off the floor, and Caleb sat at the table making a list of everything that needed attention tomorrow. You write that article yet? Raphael asked Lenora while they ate. She shook her head. Still working on it. What article? Caleb asked without looking up from his list. She's writing about ranchers, Raphael said. The ones barely hanging on. Might try to get it published somewhere. Caleb glanced at Lenora. You think anyone wants to read about that? I don't know, she admitted. But Raphael thinks I should try. Raphael thinks a lot of things. But there was something almost amused in Caleb's voice. What's it about? How people survive out here when everything's working against them. The choices they make. The things they give up. She paused. The things they refuse to give up. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then went back to his list. Write what you want. Just don't make us sound like heroes. We're just trying not to go broke. Lenora smiled despite herself. I'll keep it honest. Good. After dinner, she sat at the table with her notebook and tried to put words to what she'd seen over the past month. She wrote about storms and drought and the constant work of keeping a ranch alive. She wrote about men like Caleb and Raphael who got up every morning and did the work even when there was no guarantee it would matter. She wrote about the spring that never stopped running and what it meant to build a life around something that wouldn't quit on you. When she finally looked up, it was past midnight, and Caleb was sitting across from her, mending a bridle by lamplight. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." "I will, when I'm done with this." Lenora watched him work for a moment, his hands steady and sure, the leather taking shape under his careful attention. "Can I ask you something?" "You just did." "Why'd you really let me stay?" Caleb didn't look up from the bridle. "I told you already." "You told me someone helped you once, but that's not the whole reason." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I spent 5 years drifting before I came here. Worked every kind of job there is, saved every cent I could, and the whole time I was looking for something I couldn't name. A place, maybe. Or a reason." He pulled the leather tight, tested the strength of his repair. "When I finally bought this land, I thought I'd figured it out. But it took another year before I understood what I was really looking for." "What was it?" "Somewhere I didn't have to keep moving. Somewhere I could stay and know it wouldn't fall apart the second I stopped working." He looked at her then, his dark eyes steady. "You had that look when you showed up here. Like you'd been running so long you forgot what you were running from. I know what that feels like. So when you asked to stay a few days, I figured maybe you needed the same thing I did back then." "What's that?" "A place to stop." Lenora felt something tighten in her chest. What if I stop and it doesn't work out? Then you start moving again, but at least you'll know you tried. He went back to his work. "Now go to sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long." She closed her notebook and went to her room, but she lay awake for a long time thinking about what Caleb had said, about stopping, about trying, about what it might mean to build something instead of always leaving before you had to watch it fall apart. The next morning brought more work. They spent 3 days fixing everything the storm had damaged, and by the time they finished, another rider came through with news that made the last storm seem like nothing. The drought was spreading faster than anyone expected. 3 ranches north of them had already sold to the investors from back east. 2 more were about to. The buyers were offering cash payments that sounded generous until you realized they were buying the land for a fraction of what it was worth, then reselling it to mining companies and railroad speculators who didn't care about ranching at all. "They came by the Morrison place yesterday," the writer told them. "Made an offer right there on the spot. Morrison turned them down, but they said they'd be back." "They say when?" Caleb asked. "Soon. They're working their way south. You're probably next." After the writer left, Caleb stood in the yard with his arms crossed, staring at nothing. Raphael came and stood beside him. "What do you want to do?" Raphael asked. "What I always do, keep working." "And when they show up?" "I'll tell them the same thing Morrison did, no." "What if they don't take no for an answer?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens." Lenora watched from the porch, and something cold settled in her stomach. She'd seen enough of the territory by now to know how these things usually went. Men with money didn't ask politely when they wanted something. They pushed until you gave in or broke. She went inside and sat at the table with her notebook, but instead of writing, she just stared at the blank page. She'd been here almost 2 months now, long enough to feel like maybe she belonged, long enough to start thinking about what came next instead of just surviving today. But she'd also been around long enough to know that belonging to a place meant watching it get threatened. It meant having something to lose. She was still sitting there when Caleb came in an hour later. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her. "You worried?" he asked. "Should I be?" "Probably. That's not reassuring." "Wasn't trying to be." He drank his coffee slowly. "You planning to leave?" The question caught her off guard. "Why would I leave?" "Because things are about to get hard. Harder than they've been. And you didn't sign up for that." Lenore looked at him, at the lines around his eyes and the quiet exhaustion he carried like weight. "I didn't sign up for anything. I just showed up half dead and you gave me water. Everything after that I chose." "You can unchoose it. So can you. You could sell to these men and take the money and start over somewhere else." "That's not the same." "Why not?" Because I built this place. I put 10 years into making it work. You've been here 2 months. And in 2 months, I've hauled more water, mended more fence, and pulled more weeds than I did in 2 years of drifting. So maybe time doesn't matter as much as you think it does. She leaned forward. You asked me what I'm planning to do. I'm planning to stay. Unless you're telling me I can't. Caleb studied her for a long moment. Then he said, I'm not telling you that. Good. He almost smiled. You're stubborn. So are you. Yeah, I guess I am. 3 days later, the investors showed up. There were 4 of them, 3 men in expensive suits that looked ridiculous in the desert heat, and 1 local guide who looked uncomfortable about being there at all. They rode up to the house in a wagon pulled by horses too clean and too well fed to have done much real work. Caleb was fixing the corral fence when they arrived. He didn't stop working, just glanced up and kept hammering. The tallest of the men climbed down from the wagon and walked over, his boots kicking up dust with every step. You Caleb Mercer? That's right. I'm Clayton Watts. I represent a group of investors interested in purchasing land in this area. Not interested, Caleb said, and drove another nail into the post. Watts smiled like he'd been expecting that. You haven't heard our offer yet. Don't need to. The answer's no. Mr. Mercer, I understand you've put considerable effort into this property. That's precisely why we're interested. We're prepared to offer you $1,200 for the ranch and all water rights. Caleb stopped hammering and looked at him. You think this place is worth $1,200? We think it's a fair price given current market conditions. Then you don't know anything about ranching. Caleb went back to his work. The answer's no. You can leave now. Watts's smile tightened. Mr. Mercer, perhaps you don't understand the situation. The drought is only going to get worse. Ranchers all over this territory are selling because they know they can't survive another year. We're offering you a chance to walk away with cash in your pocket instead of watching everything you've built turn to dust. I've survived worse droughts than this. But you won't survive what's coming. We have geological surveys that show this region is entering a 10-year dry cycle. Your spring might last another year, maybe 2, but eventually it'll dry up like everything else. Then I guess I'll find out. Watt's expression hardened. You're making a mistake. Probably, but it's my mistake to make. We'll be back. Don't bother. The men climbed back into their wagon and drove off, leaving a trail of dust hanging in the still air. Raphael came out of the barn and walked over to Caleb. That could have gone worse, Raphael said. Could have gone better too. You think they meant it? About coming back? Men like that always mean it. Caleb picked up his hammer again. But meaning it and doing something about it are different things. Lenore had watched the whole exchange from inside the house, and now she came out to join them. What do we do now? Same thing we always do, Caleb said. Keep working. But over the next 2 weeks, it became clear that Watts hadn't been bluffing about the drought. The rain that had fallen during the storm was already a memory. The sun beat down relentlessly, and every day the land looked drier and more brittle. Ranches to the north and west started losing cattle. Wells that had been reliable for decades went dry. And more families sold out to Watts and his investors, taking whatever money they could get and moving on. Iron Creek held. The spring kept running, the cattle stayed healthy, and the work continued. But Lenora could feel the tension building like pressure before a storm. It was in the way Caleb checked the fences twice a day instead of once, in the way Raphael kept the rifle closer than usual, in the way they both looked at riders approaching from a distance, trying to decide if trouble was coming. One evening, Lenora rode out to check on the cattle in the north pasture and found Caleb standing by the creek, just watching the water flow past. You all right? She asked. Yeah, just thinking. She dismounted and stood beside him. About what? About what happens if Watts is right. If this drought really does last 10 years. If the spring runs dry. He was quiet for a moment. I've got enough saved to last maybe another year without selling any cattle. After that, I'll have to start making choices I don't want to make. Like what? Like whether I hold on because I'm being smart or just because I'm too stubborn to admit when I've lost. Lenora looked at the water moving over the stones, clear and cold and steady. That spring's been running for longer than you've been alive, probably longer than anyone knows. You really think it's going to quit now? I don't know, but I've learned the hard way that believing something doesn't make it true. No, but giving up early doesn't help either. Caleb glanced at her. When'd you get so sure about all this? I'm not sure about anything, but I know what it looks like when someone's built something worth keeping, and I know what it looks like when people try to take it just because they can. She paused. I've spent 2 years running from places that hurt me. I'm tired of running. So if you're asking whether I think you should fight to keep this place, the answer's yes. Even if we lose, even then. They stood there in silence while the sun sank lower and the shadows stretched long across the desert. Finally, Caleb said, You ever think about staying? Not just for a few more weeks. Really staying. Yeah, Lenora said quietly. I've been thinking about it a lot. And? And I don't know what happens next. But I know I'd rather be here finding out than somewhere else wondering. Caleb nodded slowly, like that settled something. All right then. They rode back to the house together as darkness fell, and Lenora felt something shift inside her, some last piece of resistance finally giving way. She'd been holding herself ready to leave since the day she arrived, convinced that staying too long would just mean more hurt when things inevitably fell apart. But maybe that's what it meant to build a life somewhere, not knowing for sure it would work out, but choosing to stay anyway. That night she wrote for hours, words pouring onto the page faster than she could think them through. She wrote about drought and survival and the way people held on to what mattered, even when everything else was slipping away. She wrote about springs that kept running, and men who kept working, and women who finally stopped moving long enough to see what they'd been running past. When she finished, she had 20 pages, more than she'd written in one sitting since her mother died. She read it through once, made a few changes, and then folded the pages carefully and put them in an envelope. The next morning, she rode into the nearest town and mailed the article to a newspaper in Santa Fe. She didn't know if they'd publish it. Didn't know if anyone would care about a story about ranchers fighting to survive in a territory most people back east had never heard of. But she'd written it anyway. And that felt like something. When she got back to the ranch, Raphael was in the yard teaching a group of neighboring ranchers how to reinforce well casings to keep them from collapsing in dry soil. 6 men and 2 women stood around him, taking notes and asking questions. And Lenora realized this was happening more often now. People coming to Iron Creek for advice, for help, for water, when their own sources failed. Caleb was charging them nothing, just letting them take what they needed and offering whatever knowledge he had. Why don't you charge them? Lenora asked him later while they were fixing a section of roof on the barn. For what? Water? It's your water. You could make money off it. I could, but then I'd be no different than Watts and his people. He hammered a nail into place. Besides, these folks are barely hanging on as it is. Taking their money would just mean they fold faster. Even if it means you fold instead? We're not folding, we're holding. What's the difference? Folding means you gave up. Holding means you're still in the fight. Lenora thought about that while they worked. About the difference between surviving alone and surviving together. About what it costs to help people when you could barely help yourself. That night, 3 more families showed up at the ranch looking for water. Caleb let them fill their barrels from the spring and sent them home with sacks of beans and dried corn. After they left, Lenora found him sitting on the porch looking exhausted. You can't feed the whole territory, she said. I know. So why are you trying? Because if I don't, who will? He rubbed his face with both hands. These people aren't asking for handouts. They're asking for a chance to make it through to the next rain. And if I've got water to spare, I'm going to give it to them. What if the spring does run dry? Then we'll deal with it. But I'm not going to sit here with water while my neighbors die of thirst, just because I'm worried about what might happen. Lenora sat down beside him. You're a better man than most. I'm just a man who remembers what it's like to have nothing. That's all. 3 weeks after the investors' first visit, they came back. This time there were more of them, 8 men instead of 4, and they brought a surveyor with equipment for measuring water flow. Caleb met them at the property line. You're not welcome here. Watts climbed down from his wagon, flanked by 2 men who looked less like businessmen and more like the kind of people you hired when you needed someone hurt. Mr. Mercer, we're simply here to conduct a survey. We have a right to assess water sources in the territory. You have a right to assess public water sources. This is private property. We're prepared to compensate you for your time. I don't want your compensation. I want you to leave. One of the hired men stepped forward. We can do this easy, or we can do it hard. Raphael appeared from the barn, rifle in hand, not pointing it at anyone, but making it very clear he had it. He told you to leave. You should probably listen. The surveyor looked nervous. Watts looked annoyed. The hired men looked like they were calculating whether the money was worth the trouble. Finally, Watts said, "We'll be filing a complaint with the territorial office. They'll send someone to inspect your water rights. Let them. My rights are in order. We'll see about that." The men left, and this time Caleb watched them until they were completely out of sight. Then he turned to Raphael. "They're going to come back with the law next time." "You think the law's going to take their side?" "I think the law takes whatever side has the most money." Caleb started walking toward the house. "We need to get everything documented. Every transaction, every water test, every legal paper I've got. If they're going to try to take this place, I want to make them work for it." Over the next week, Caleb and Raphael dug through old files and records, organizing everything that proved Caleb's legal ownership of the ranch and the water rights. Lenora helped where she could, but mostly she watched and realized just how precarious survival was out here. One legal technicality, one missed payment, one piece of paper in the wrong hands, and everything Caleb had built could disappear. She wrote about that too, about how the law was supposed to protect people, but mostly just protected whoever could afford the best lawyers. About how men like Watts used legal language like a weapon, finding loopholes and technicalities that let them take what they wanted without ever getting their hands dirty. The article she'd sent to Santa Fe came back a week later with a short note from the editor. "Interesting perspective. We'll run it in next month's edition. Send more if you have them." Lenora showed the note to Raphael, who grinned like she'd just won a prize. "I told you, people want to hear this. It's just one article. It's a start. Now write another one." So she did. She wrote about families losing their land to drought and debt, about communities coming together to share water and resources, about the quiet heroism of people who got up every morning and did the work even when the odds were stacked against them. And slowly, people started noticing. A newspaper in Albuquerque picked up one of her articles and ran it on the front page. A magazine back east asked permission to reprint another. Letters started arriving at the ranch from people who'd read her work and wanted to know more about life on the frontier. "You're getting famous," Raphael said one evening while they were cooking dinner. "I'm getting read. That's different." "Not that different." Caleb came in from outside looking tired and dusty. "Another family just showed up for water. I told them to come back tomorrow when we've got the barrels filled." "How many does that make this week?" Lenora asked. 7 families, plus Morrison came by asking for advice on reinforcing his well. "You giving it to him?" "Of course I'm giving it to him. What am I going to do? Let his well collapse?" Caleb sat down heavily. "But at some point, we're going to have to figure out how to help more people than I can reach by myself." Lenora looked at him, an idea forming. "What if you didn't have to reach them yourself? What if we could get the information out to everyone at once?" "How?" "Articles, practical guides on surviving drought conditions, how to reinforce wells, how to conserve water, how to keep cattle alive when grazing's thin. I could write them. Newspapers would run them. People all over the territory could read them." Caleb considered that. "You think people would actually follow advice from a newspaper?" "I think people are desperate enough to try anything. And coming from you, it'd be solid advice." "Coming from me? You've kept this ranch alive through worse conditions than most people can imagine. That's worth something." Raphael nodded. "She's right. You know things most ranchers don't. Sharing that knowledge could save people." Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "All right, what do you need from me?" That night, Lenora interviewed Caleb about everything he'd learned in 10 years of ranching in drought conditions. He talked for 3 hours straight about soil conservation and water management and reading weather patterns and making hard choices about which cattle to keep and which to sell. She wrote it all down, her hand cramping from the constant work. And by the end, she had enough material for a dozen articles. "This is good," she said, reading back through her notes. "This could actually help people." "Let's hope so," Caleb said, "because things are going to get worse before they get better." He was right. The drought deepened through October and into November. The heat stayed brutal even as the calendar said it should be cooling. More ranches folded, more families sold out, and the investors kept circling, buying up land and water rights and consolidating power. But Iron Creek held. The spring kept running, and Lenora's articles kept spreading, reaching people across the territory who were fighting the same battles Caleb fought every day. One evening in late November, a rider came from Santa Fe with a letter for Lenora. She opened it and read silently while Caleb and Raphael watched. "What is it?" Raphael asked. "It's from the newspaper. They want me to come to Santa Fe. They're offering me a regular column. Steady pay." She looked up. "They want me to write about the frontier full-time." Caleb's expression didn't change. "That's good. That's what you wanted, isn't it?" "I don't know what I wanted." She folded the letter carefully. "They want me to start in January. That gives me 6 weeks to decide." "What's there to decide?" Raphael asked. "This is your chance." "My chance for what? To leave right when things are getting dangerous here? To go write about the frontier from a comfortable office in Santa Fe while you're out here fighting to keep the ranch alive?" "That's not your fight," Caleb said quietly. "The hell it isn't." Lenora stood up, suddenly angry. "I've been here 5 months. I've worked this land same as you. I've fed those families same as you. I've written about this place and these people and made them matter to the rest of the territory. So don't tell me it's not my fight." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "Then what do you want to do?" "I want to stay, and I want to keep writing, and I want to figure out how to do both." She wrote back to the newspaper with a proposal. She'd write the column, but she'd do it from Iron Creek. She'd send articles by mail and telegram. She'd cover the drought and the land struggles from the ground, not from a safe distance. 2 weeks later, they wrote back, accepting her terms. By early December, Lenora had become the unofficial voice of frontier ranchers across New Mexico territory. Her articles ran in papers from Santa Fe to Denver, and people started recognizing the name Iron Creek Ranch as the place where good information came from, where people went when they needed help, and that's when everything changed. On December 15th, 3 days before Christmas, Clayton Watts came back with 20 men, a territorial marshal, and a court order claiming that Caleb's water rights were invalid due to a surveying error made 15 years ago. The land Iron Creek sat on, they said, had been mismeasured and actually belonged to a railroad company that had sold it to Watts's investors. Caleb read the court order twice, his face getting harder with every word. "This is fake," he said finally. "I've got the original survey. The measurements were done right." "The court disagrees," Watts said. "You have 72 hours to vacate the property or you'll be removed by force." Raphael's hand moved toward his rifle. Caleb put a hand on his arm, stopping him. "We're not leaving," Caleb said. "Then you're breaking the law." "The law's breaking itself if it's backing this." The marshal looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Mercer, I'm just here to enforce the order. You want to fight it? You do it in court." "Court's in Santa Fe. I don't have money for lawyers. That's the whole point of this, isn't it?" Caleb looked at Watts. "You couldn't buy me out, so you found a legal trick to take it anyway." Watts smiled. "Business is business, Mr. Mercer. You should have taken the money when you had the chance." After they left, Caleb stood in the yard for a long time. The court order crumpled in his fist. Lenora and Raphael stood beside him, neither knowing what to say. Finally, Caleb spoke. 72 hours. We've got 72 hours to figure out how to fight this." "How do we fight a court order?" Raphael asked. Caleb didn't answer. He just walked toward the house, and Lenora had never seen him look so tired. She stood there watching him go and felt something harden inside her. They'd tried to survive quietly. They'd tried to help their neighbors. They'd tried to do everything right, and it still wasn't enough. But maybe quiet survival wasn't the answer anymore. Maybe it was time to make some noise. She went inside and sat down at the table with her notebook and started writing the most important article of her life. The article went out on telegraph wires the next morning to every newspaper that had ever published Lenora's work. She titled it "The Legal Theft of Iron Creek Ranch," and she didn't hold back. She named Clayton Watts and his investors. She detailed the fake surveying error and the court order that appeared out of nowhere. She explained how men with money were using the law as a weapon to steal land from people who'd built their lives on it. By noon, responses started coming back. Editors wanted more details. Other ranchers telegraphed saying they'd faced similar tactics. A lawyer in Santa Fe sent word that he'd look into the court order for free if Caleb would let him. "This is going to make them angry," Raphael said, reading one of the telegrams over Lenora's shoulder. "Good," Lenora said. "I want them angry. Angry people make mistakes." Caleb came in from outside, dust covering his clothes from checking fence lines one more time. "What are you doing?" Fighting back the only way I know how." She handed him the article she'd written. He read it slowly, his jaw working like he was chewing something bitter. When he finished, he set the paper down and looked at her. "This is going to make things worse before they get better. Things are already bad. At least this way people know what's happening. People knowing doesn't change the law." "Maybe not, but it changes how many people are watching when they try to enforce it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once. "All right, we do it your way. But when Watts shows up with those 20 men, words aren't going to stop them." "Then we need more than words." Lenora pulled out her notebook and started writing names. "Morrison's ranch is 10 miles north, the Becker family's west of here. Chen's place is south. All of them have been coming here for water. All of them know what happens if Watts takes this spring." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we ask for help. We've been helping them for months. Maybe it's time they help us back." Raphael grinned. "I like her plan better than yours." "I didn't have a plan," Caleb admitted. "I was just going to stand here with a rifle and see what happened." "That's a terrible plan," Lenora said. "Yeah, I know." Within 2 hours, Raphael was riding to the neighboring ranches with copies of Lenora's article and a message that Iron Creek needed people willing to stand witness when the marshal came back. By evening, word had spread to a dozen families. By morning, responses started coming in. Morrison sent word he'd be there with his 2 sons. The Beckers said they'd come with neighbors from 2 other ranches. Chen wrote back saying he'd already organized 8 families in his area and they'd all ride together. "How many people you think we'll get?" Raphael asked while they waited. "No idea," Lenora said. "But however many show up, it'll be more than Watts expects." The 72 hours crept past. Caleb worked like a man trying to memorize every inch of his land before someone took it away. He walked the fence lines, checked the cattle, stood by the spring for long stretches just watching the water flow. Lenora caught him there on the second night, silhouetted against the stars. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Don't see much point in it." He didn't turn around. "I built this place from nothing. Every fence post, every building, every damn stone in that spring bed, I put it there. And now some men in suits are going to take it because they found a judge who'd signed the right paper." Lenora moved to stand beside him. "They haven't taken it yet." 72 hours, Lenora. That's all the time we've got left." "Then we make those hours count." He finally looked at her. "You know there's a good chance this doesn't work. Court order's legal, even if it's crooked. The marshal's got the law on his side. Best case, we delay things a few weeks. Worst case, people get hurt trying to defend something that's already lost." "You really believe it's lost?" "I don't know what I believe anymore. I just know I'm tired of fighting battles I can't win." "Then don't fight them alone." Caleb studied her face in the starlight. "Why are you doing this? You could have taken that job in Santa Fe, been safe and comfortable. Instead, you're here risking everything for a ranch that isn't even yours. Because it is mine. Not legally, maybe. But I've worked this land. I've fed these cattle. I've hauled water from that spring until my back hurt and my hands bled. I've written about this place until people across the territory know its name. So yeah, it's mine. Same as it's yours. Same as it belongs to everyone who's ever drunk from this water or found shelter under these cottonwoods." She paused. "Besides, where else am I going to go?" "You could go anywhere. I spent 2 years going anywhere. It didn't make me any less lost." She looked at the spring, at the way moonlight caught on the moving water. "I'm done running, Caleb. Whatever happens when that marshal shows up, I'm staying." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the most foolish." "Probably both." This time he did smile, just a little. "Yeah, probably." On the morning of the 3rd day, people started arriving. Morrison came first with his sons, both of them carrying rifles they clearly knew how to use. The Beckers showed up an hour later with 3 neighboring families, their wagons loaded with supplies like they were planning to stay a while. Chen arrived with a group so large Lenora lost count, at least 15 people, maybe 20, some of them ranchers and some just townspeople who'd read her articles and decided this mattered. By noon, there were 47 people gathered at Iron Creek Ranch. They set up camps in the yard and along the creek. Women organized food and water. Men checked weapons and talked in low voices about what might happen. Children ran between the cottonwoods, turning the whole thing into something that felt more like a strange picnic than a standoff. Lenora moved through the crowd, listening to conversations and taking notes. She'd started writing the moment people began arriving, documenting everything: names, faces, reasons they'd come. She wanted a record of this, whatever happened. "You Chen's wife?" an older woman asked her at one point. "No, I work here, with Caleb and Raphael." The woman looked her up and down. "You're the one writing those articles?" "Yes, ma'am. My husband says you tell the truth about what's happening out here. Says you don't make us sound like fools or heroes, just people trying to survive. That's all most of us are." "Well," the woman squeezed her arm, "you keep writing the truth. Someone needs to." Late afternoon, a rider appeared on the ridge to the north. A lookout Chen had posted to give them warning. He rode down fast, his horse lathered. "They're coming," he called. "Maybe 30 minutes out." The camp went quiet. People who'd been laughing and talking suddenly found tasks to occupy their hands. Weapons got checked one more time. Parents pulled children closer. Caleb stood in the center of the yard, Raphael on one side and Lenora on the other. "Listen up," he called, his voice carrying. "When they get here, nobody starts anything. Nobody fires unless I give the word. We're not looking for a fight. We're just showing them they can't do this quietly." "What if they try to force us out anyway?" Morrison asked. "Then we stand our ground, but peacefully. Let them be the ones who turn this into something violent. Let them be the ones people remember as the aggressors." "You really think that'll matter?" "I think it's the only chance we've got." The 30 minutes crawled past. Then dust appeared on the horizon, and the riders came into view. Clayton Watts led the way, flanked by the territorial marshal and at least 20 hired men who looked like they'd seen more than their share of trouble. Behind them came a wagon carrying surveying equipment and what looked like legal documents. They stopped at the edge of the property, clearly not expecting the crowd waiting for them. Watts climbed down from his horse slowly, his eyes scanning the assembled faces. "What's this?" "Witnesses," Caleb said. "People who want to make sure everything's done legal and proper. This is none of their concern. This spring feeds half the ranches in 50 miles. It's everyone's concern." The marshal moved forward, looking uncomfortable with the whole situation. "Mr. Mercer, I have a court order requiring you to vacate this property. The presence of these people doesn't change that. I'm not disputing you've got an order. I'm disputing that the order's legitimate. That's for a judge to decide. A judge already decided, without letting me present evidence, without even telling me there was a case being filed." Caleb pulled papers from his pocket. "I've got the original survey right here. The measurements are accurate. Someone falsified documents to make it look like there was an error, and you know it. I don't know anything except what the court told me." The marshal shifted his weight, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. "Look, I understand this is your home, but the law's the law. You've got until sundown to gather your things and leave, or I'll have to remove you by force." "You remove him! You remove all of us!" Morrison called out. A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. Watts's face reddened. "You people are interfering with a legal proceeding. You could all be arrested." "For what?" Lenore stepped forward. "For standing on public land watching you steal a man's property?" "Who are you?" "Lenora Hale. I write for the Santa Fe Register and about a dozen other papers, and I'm documenting everything that happens here today." Watts's expression went cold. "You're the one writing those articles." "That's right. And tomorrow morning, everyone in the territory is going to read about what happened here, how many men you brought, what weapons they're carrying, whether you removed a rancher peacefully or with violence." She paused. "People are watching now, Mr. Watts. You can't do this in the dark anymore." For a long moment, nobody moved. The hired men looked at each other, clearly calculating whether the money was worth the trouble. The marshal looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Watts looked like he was trying to decide whether to back down or double down. Finally, he said, "This isn't over. We'll be back with more men and a stronger order, and next time no amount of witnesses will stop us." "Maybe not," Caleb said, "but you'll have to go through all of us to do it. And I promise you, that's going to make the kind of news you don't want." Watts stared at him for another long moment. Then he climbed back on his horse. "You've got 1 week. After that, we come back with whatever force is necessary." The riders turned and left, dust rising behind them in the late afternoon sun. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Caleb held up his hand for quiet. "This isn't a victory. This is a delay. They'll be back, just like they said, and next time they'll come with more men and a plan for dealing with witnesses. So what do we do? Chen asked. We use the time. We get a real lawyer to look at these documents. We file our own motions with the court. We make as much noise as possible so everyone in the territory knows what's happening. He looked at Lenora. And we keep writing. Over the next 3 days, Lenora barely slept. She wrote article after article, each one more detailed than the last. She documented the fake surveying error. She interviewed the lawyer who'd agreed to help and published his findings about irregularities in the court order. She tracked down the original surveyor, a man now in his 70s, who swore under oath that his measurements had been accurate and someone must have altered the records. The articles spread like wildfire. Papers across the territory picked them up. People started organizing protests in Santa Fe. The territorial governor's office received so many letters they had to hire extra staff just to read them all. And slowly, the momentum started to shift. A judge in Albuquerque read Lenora's articles and launched his own investigation into the court order. A reporter from Denver came down to interview Caleb and ended up writing a scathing piece about legal corruption in the territory. 2 of Watts's investors pulled out of the deal after their names appeared in print, and they started receiving threats from angry ranchers. But Watts didn't give up. On the 6th day, word came that he'd hired 30 more men and was planning to force the issue regardless of what the court said. He was going to take Iron Creek by force and dare anyone to stop him. They're coming tomorrow, the writer who brought the news said, sundown, with enough men to overwhelm anyone who stands in their way. After the writer left, Caleb stood in the yard and looked at the people who'd stayed to help. Most of the crowd had gone home after the first standoff, but about 20 people remained, those who had nowhere else to draw water or those who believed strongly enough in what Iron Creek represented that they were willing to risk everything to defend it. Anyone who wants to leave should leave now, Caleb said. What's coming tomorrow isn't going to be peaceful. Watts is done playing by rules. He's going to take what he wants, and people are going to get hurt trying to stop him. Morrison spoke up first. I'm staying. My ranch dies if this spring goes to Watts. I'd rather fight now than die slow watching my cattle starve. My family's staying too, Chen said. We came here with nothing. You gave us water and food when we had neither. We don't abandon people who helped us. One by one, the others agreed. They'd stay. They'd fight if they had to. They'd stand together because alone they had no chance at all. That night, Lenora found Caleb sitting on the porch, cleaning his rifle in the lamplight. She sat beside him without saying anything for a while, just listening to the sounds of the camp settling in for sleep. You scared? She asked finally. Terrified, he admitted, but that doesn't change anything. We could still leave, all of us. Just walk away and let Watts have it. Could you do that? No. Then I guess we're both stuck here. Lenora looked at the spring, barely visible in the darkness, but audible in the way water always was, constant and steady and alive. You know what I think about when I look at that spring? What? I think about how water doesn't care who owns the land it runs through. It doesn't care about court orders or legal documents or men with guns. It just keeps flowing because that's what water does. It finds a way through. She paused. Maybe that's what we do too. Just keep flowing, keep moving forward, and trust that eventually we'll find a way through. Caleb looked at her, something soft in his eyes despite the hardness of everything else. When this is over, if we make it through, will you stay? You asking me to? I'm asking if you want to. Lenora thought about the last 6 months, about arriving half dead with a dying horse and nowhere to go, about slowly becoming part of something instead of always moving past it, about finding work that mattered and words that reached people in a place that felt like it might actually be home. Yeah, she said quietly. I want to stay. Caleb nodded slowly. Then we'll make sure there's something left to stay for. The next day dawned hot and cloudless. The people who'd stayed through the night prepared as best they could. They positioned themselves around the spring and along the fence lines. They kept their weapons close, but not drawn. They made sure the children were inside the house, away from whatever was coming. And they waited. Midday came and went. Afternoon stretched long. People started wondering if maybe Watts had changed his mind, if maybe the pressure had finally worked. Then, just as the sun started sinking toward the horizon, the riders appeared. There were at least 40 of them this time, maybe more. They came from multiple directions at once, spreading out to surround the property. Most were hired guns, hard men with dead eyes who did this kind of work for a living. A few were deputies sworn in special for the occasion. And at the center of it all was Clayton Watts, sitting on his horse like a general surveying a battlefield. The marshal from before was there too, looking even more uncomfortable than last time. He rode forward slowly, stopping about 20 yards from where Caleb stood. "Mr. Mercer, I've been ordered to remove you from this property by any means necessary. I'm asking you one last time to comply peacefully. And I'm telling you one last time that this court order is fraudulent. You're helping a criminal steal land, and history's going to remember you for it." "History remembers winners," Watts called out, "and you've already lost." He made a signal, and the hired men started moving forward, slowly at first, then faster. Caleb raised his rifle, not pointing it at anyone yet, just making it visible. The people around him did the same. "Don't do this," the marshal said. But there was no force in his voice. He knew what was about to happen, and he knew he couldn't stop it. The hired men kept coming. Lenora stood beside Caleb, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She'd never shot anyone, never even pointed a gun at another human being, but her hands were steady as she raised the rifle Raphael had given her that morning, and she knew without question that she'd use it if she had to. The hired men were 30 yards away, 25, 20. Then a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Hold it right there." Everyone froze. A new group of riders appeared from the north, at least 50 of them, maybe more. Leading them was an older man with a badge that caught the failing sunlight. He rode straight toward Watts and the marshal, his face carved from stone. "I'm Federal Marshal William Cross," he said. "And you're all under arrest for attempted land fraud." Watts went pale. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about falsified surveying documents. I'm talking about bribed court officials. I'm talking about a conspiracy to defraud multiple property owners across this territory." Cross pulled papers from his saddlebag. "A federal judge in Denver issued warrants this morning. You're done, Watts." "This is absurd. I have legal documentation. You have fake documents produced by a surveyor you paid to lie. We've got him in custody already. He confessed to everything." The territorial marshal looked between Cross and Watts, clearly trying to figure out which side of this he wanted to be on. "I was just enforcing a court order." "A court order obtained through fraud," Cross said. "If you had any part in that fraud, you're coming with me too." "I didn't know." "Then you should have asked more questions before you brought armed men to steal a man's home." Cross's deputies moved through the crowd, placing Watts and several of the hired men in chains. The territorial marshal wisely decided to cooperate, handing over all his documents without protest. Within an hour, the whole group was riding north toward Santa Fe, leaving behind a stunned silence. Caleb lowered his rifle slowly, like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. "What the hell was that?" Lenora started laughing, not because anything was funny, but because the tension had to break somehow. "I think that was the governor's office deciding they didn't want the whole territory reading about legal corruption in my next article." "You think your articles did that?" "I think 40 newspapers running the same story about fraud and theft got someone's attention. I think people in Denver and Washington started asking questions, and I think Watts finally pushed far enough that someone with real authority pushed back." Raphael came up behind them, grinning wider than Lenora had ever seen. "We won. We actually won." "We survived," Caleb corrected. "That's not the same thing as winning." But he was smiling too, just a little. And when he looked at Lenora, there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Something that looked almost like hope. The people who'd stayed to defend the ranch erupted into celebration. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey that got passed around until it was empty. Morrison started a fire, and people gathered around it as darkness fell, telling stories and laughing with the relief that came from surviving something that should have broken them. Lenora sat beside the spring, writing everything down while it was still fresh. She wanted to capture this moment, not just the victory, but what it had cost to get here, the fear and exhaustion and desperate hope that had kept them going. Caleb found her there an hour later. He sat down beside her without saying anything, just watching the water flow past in the firelight. "Thank you," he said finally. "For what?" "For staying, for fighting, for making enough noise that someone finally listened." He paused. "For making this place mean something to more people than just me." "It always meant something. I just helped other people see it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Caleb said, "That offer I made you the first day you got here. As long as the spring runs, you're welcome. I meant it then and I mean it now, but I'm hoping you'll stay for more than just water." Lenora looked at him, at the lines around his eyes and the careful way he held himself, like a man who'd learned not to hope for too much because hoping hurt when it didn't work out. "What are you asking, Caleb?" "I'm asking if you want to build something here. Not just survive, but actually build. Make this ranch into something bigger. Make this spring into something that helps the whole territory." He met her eyes. "I'm asking if you want to do that with me. As a partner? As whatever you want to be." Lenora felt her chest tighten. She'd spent 2 years running from anything that looked like permanence, convinced that staying meant eventually losing. But somewhere between arriving half dead and sitting here watching water flow through land they'd fought to keep, she'd stopped running. She'd stopped looking for the next place to go because she'd found a place worth staying for. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I want to build something. With you." Caleb's expression softened in a way she'd never seen before. He reached out and took her hand. Rough calluses against rough calluses. Two people who'd worked themselves raw trying to survive. "All right then," he said. "Let's get started." The next morning, Lenora rode into the nearest town and sent telegrams to every newspaper that had published her work. She told them Iron Creek Ranch had survived. She told them about the federal marshal and the arrests and the beginning of real investigations into land fraud across the territory. She told them this wasn't just about one ranch. It was about whether the law would protect people who built lives with their hands or just people who had money enough to buy whatever they wanted. The story exploded. Within a week, reporters from as far away as New York were traveling to New Mexico territory to cover what they were calling the Iron Creek Stand. Federal investigators descended on territorial offices, digging through records and finding fraud in dozens of land transactions. Judges who'd signed questionable orders found themselves under scrutiny. And Clayton Watts and his investors found themselves facing charges that would keep them in court for years. But more than that, Iron Creek became a symbol, a proof that fighting back was possible, that ordinary people could stand against corruption if they stood together. Ranchers who'd been on the edge of selling out decided to hold on a little longer. Communities started organizing to share water and resources. And territorial officials, suddenly aware that people were watching, started actually enforcing laws that protected small landowners instead of just looking the other way. It wasn't a perfect victory. The drought was still brutal. Families still struggled. And the work of keeping Iron Creek alive was just as hard as it had always been. But they'd survived. And somehow, that felt like enough. 2 weeks after the federal marshal hauled Clayton Watts away, the rain finally came. Not the violent storms that had torn through in September, but a steady, soaking rain that lasted 3 days and turned the desert green in ways Lenora hadn't known were possible. The creek swelled and ran fast over its stones. The cattle lifted their heads and stood in the downpour like they were trying to remember what water from the sky felt like. The garden, which had been limping along on careful irrigation, suddenly exploded with growth. Lenora stood on the porch watching it fall, and Caleb came to stand beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "Raphael says if this keeps up, we might actually make it through winter without selling half the herd," he said. "That's good news." "Yeah, strange how good news feels after you've gone so long without it." He drank his coffee slowly. "You planning to write about this too?" "About rain? About what comes after, the rebuilding, the part where we figure out how to move forward instead of just survive." Lenora thought about that. People want to hear about the fight, about standing up to corruption. I'm not sure they care much about what happens when the fighting stops. Maybe they should. Maybe that's the part that actually matters. He looked at her. "You stayed because you wanted to build something, so build it. Show people what that looks like." She wrote about it that night, not the dramatic confrontation with Watts, but the quiet work that came after. The fences that needed mending after being neglected during the standoff. The relationships with neighboring ranchers that had grown stronger through shared struggle. The way the territory was starting to organize itself differently, with communities pooling resources instead of every ranch trying to survive alone. The articles didn't get picked up by as many papers as the ones about the standoff, but the letters she received were different, more personal. People writing to say they'd been inspired to start their own community projects. Ranchers forming co-ops to share equipment and labor. towns organizing better water management systems. You're changing things, Raphael said one evening while they were cooking dinner. Not just writing about them, actually changing them. I'm just telling people what's already happening. No, you're showing people what's possible. That's different. Caleb came in from checking the cattle, his clothes soaked despite the rain having stopped hours ago. Morrison came by while you were in town. Says 3 more families want to join the water sharing agreement. That's 8 families now, Lenora said. We're going to need a better system for tracking usage. I'll work on it. Caleb poured himself coffee and sat at the table. Also got a letter from that lawyer in Santa Fe, the one who helped us with the court case. He wants to set up a meeting. About what? About making sure what happened to us doesn't happen to anyone else. He's proposing new territorial laws for water rights and land surveys. Wants me to come testify about our experience. Lenora looked up from the stove. You gonna do it? Don't see why. I'm a rancher, not a politician. You're a man who knows firsthand how the current system fails people. That makes you exactly who they need to hear from. Caleb rubbed his face with both hands. I don't like leaving the ranch. Then I'll go with you, Lenora said. We'll both testify. Show them this isn't just about one man's land. It's about whether small ranchers have any protection at all against people with money. You offering to hold my hand through it? If that's what it takes? He almost smiled. All right, we'll go. But if they try to turn this into some kind of political circus, I'm walking out. They rode to Santa Fe 2 weeks later, leaving Raphael in charge of the ranch. The trip took 3 days, and Lenora watched Caleb get more tense with every mile that put them further from Iron Creek. He wasn't a man who liked being away from the work, and he trusted Raphael completely, but still worried about everything that could go wrong in his absence. The ranch isn't going to disappear while we're gone, Lenora said on the second night, when she caught him staring back toward the direction they'd come from. I know that. Do you? Because you've checked that direction about 50 times today. I spent 10 years building that place. Hard to just walk away from it, even for a few days. We're not walking away. We're fighting for it in a different way. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You ever wonder if we're fighting for the wrong things? If maybe we should have just taken Watts's money and started over somewhere else? Do you wish you had? No, but I wonder if life would be easier. Easier doesn't mean better. Lenora moved closer to the fire they'd built. You taught me that. The day I showed up dying of thirst, you could have just given me water and sent me on my way. Would have been easier. Instead, you let me stay, and that choice changed everything. For better or worse. You tell me. He looked at her across the fire, his face shadowed and serious. Better. Definitely better. They arrived in Santa Fe on the 3rd day. The city felt overwhelming after months of empty desert. Too many people, too much noise, too many buildings crowding together like they were trying to block out the sky. Caleb looked uncomfortable the moment they rode in, his shoulders tight and his eyes tracking everything like he expected trouble. The lawyer, whose name was James Mitchell, met them at a boarding house near the territorial offices. He was younger than Lenora expected, maybe 35, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of energy that came from believing the law could actually fix things. Thank you for coming, he said, shaking both their hands. Your testimony could be crucial for getting these reforms passed. What exactly are you proposing? Caleb asked. Mitchell pulled out a stack of papers covered in legal language. New requirements for land surveys with multiple independent verifications before any court can rule on boundary disputes. Mandatory notification to property owners when cases are filed against their land. And most importantly, federal oversight of water rights to prevent exactly the kind of fraud you experienced. How many people are fighting this? Lenora asked. Everyone who profits from the current system, which is a lot of people. Mitchell looked at them seriously. The hearing's tomorrow. There'll be mining companies, railroad interests, land speculators. All of them will argue these reforms will destroy economic development in the territory. We need voices like yours to show the human cost of the current system. That night, Lenora lay awake in the boarding house room, listening to unfamiliar city sounds and thinking about what they were about to walk into. She'd written dozens of articles about corruption and fraud. She'd made plenty of people angry with her words, but walking into a government hearing and saying those same things directly to the men she'd written about, that felt different, more dangerous somehow. Caleb was awake too. She could tell by his breathing. You nervous? She asked quietly. Terrified. You don't seem like someone who gets terrified of much. I can face down drought and hired guns. But politicians and lawyers? He shifted in the darkness. Give me an honest enemy any day. What if they ask questions you don't know how to answer? Then I'll tell them I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not just to make them feel better about listening to me. The hearing room the next morning was smaller than Lenora expected, but filled with more people than could comfortably fit. Territorial officials sat at a raised table at the front. Lawyers for various interests lined the walls. And in the gallery were ranchers, businessmen, reporters, and curious citizens who'd heard about the Iron Creek case and wanted to see how it played out. Mitchell presented his proposals first, methodically explaining each reform and why it was necessary. Then he called Caleb to testify. Caleb walked to the front of the room like he was walking to a hanging. He sat in the witness chair, refused to remove his hat, even when someone suggested it, and waited for the questions. "Mr. Mercer," one of the officials began, "can you describe in your own words what happened with your property?" Caleb told the story plainly. No embellishment, no dramatic language, just the facts of men showing up with a fake court order, trying to steal land he'd spent a decade building on, and nearly succeeding because he didn't have money for lawyers or political connections. "And you believe these proposed reforms would have prevented your situation?" another official asked. "I believe if someone had been required to tell me there was a case against my land, I could have defended myself before it got to the point of armed men showing up. I believe if surveys required independent verification, it would have been harder to falsify the documents. And I believe if there was federal oversight of water rights, men like Clayton Watts wouldn't feel so comfortable trying to steal them." A lawyer for the mining interests stood up. "Mr. Mercer, isn't it true that you've benefited significantly from publicity around your case, that you've used your situation to gain influence and even celebrity status?" "I don't know about celebrity," Caleb said flatly, "but if people knowing my story helps prevent the same thing from happening to someone else, then yeah, I benefited from the publicity. So did everyone who read about it and realized the system's broken. The system provided you with legal recourse. A federal marshal intervened on your behalf. Doesn't that prove the system works? The system only worked because enough people made enough noise that someone finally paid attention. If Lenora hadn't written those articles, if newspapers hadn't run them, if people hadn't shown up to witness what was happening, Watts would have taken my land and that would have been the end of it." Caleb leaned forward. "You shouldn't have to go through all that just to keep what's rightfully yours. That's not a system working. That's a system failing until people force it to do better." The questioning went on for another hour. Some officials seemed genuinely interested in reform. Others clearly saw Caleb as a threat to their interests and tried to make him look like a troublemaker who didn't understand how business worked in the territory. Then they called Lenora. She walked to the front feeling every eye in the room on her. A woman testifying in a territorial hearing wasn't common, and she could feel the skepticism radiating from some of the officials before she even sat down. "Miss Hale," one of them began, putting emphasis on the miss in a way that suggested he didn't approve of unmarried women speaking publicly. "You've written extensively about Mr. Mercer's case. Some would say you've sensationalized it to sell newspapers. Some would be wrong," Lenora said calmly. "I documented what happened because it was true and because people deserve to know. If the truth sounds sensational, maybe that says more about how corrupt the system is than it does about my writing. You're not a lawyer. You're not a surveyor. You're not qualified to assess the legal validity of land claims. Yet you wrote articles questioning official court orders. I'm qualified to see when something's wrong and say so. That court order was obtained through fraud. A federal investigation confirmed that. So my articles weren't questioning legitimate authority. They were exposing corruption." A different official spoke up. "Miss Hale, do you believe women should have a voice in territorial affairs?" The room went very quiet. It was a trap question, designed to make her either back down or say something that would make the men in the room dismiss everything she'd said. Lenora looked directly at him. "I believe people who work the land, who build lives on it, who fight to keep it, those people should have a voice regardless of what's between their legs. I've hauled as much water and mended as much fence as any man at Iron Creek. I've documented corruption that male reporters ignored, and I've helped organize communities that are now stronger because they learned to work together. So yes, I believe I should have a voice, and I believe any woman doing the same work should have one too." The official's face reddened, but before he could respond, another one cut in. These reforms you're supporting would slow down land development significantly. Don't you think territorial growth is important? Not if that growth is built on theft. Not if it means destroying the people who are already here building sustainable communities. Lenora pulled out her notebook. I've got letters from 47 families across this territory who faced similar situations to Iron Creek. Some lost their land. Some are still fighting. All of them are asking whether the law protects them or just protects whoever has the most money. Your reforms might slow down the kind of growth that benefits speculators, but they'd protect the kind of growth that actually sustains communities. The questioning continued, but Lenora could tell something had shifted. Some of the officials were actually listening now instead of just performing skepticism. The reporters in the room were taking notes furiously. And when she finally stepped down, several people in the gallery nodded at her in a way that felt like acknowledgement. Mitchell called 2 more witnesses, ranchers who'd lost land to similar schemes. Then the hearing ended and everyone filed out into the bright Santa Fe afternoon. You did good in there, Caleb said as they walked back toward the boarding house. You too. I liked the part where you called the system broken to their faces. Didn't see much point in being polite about it. Mitchell caught up with them, slightly breathless. That was excellent testimony from both of you. I think we actually have a chance at getting some of these reforms passed. How long will that take? Lenora asked. Months, probably. Maybe longer. But you've given us real momentum. He paused. There's something else. Several newspapers want interviews with both of you. There's talk of publishing a book about the Iron Creek case, and the territorial governor wants to meet with you personally. Caleb and Lenora looked at each other. No, Caleb said. No to what? All of it. We did what we came here to do. Now we're going home. But this could be an opportunity to what? Become symbols instead of people? Caleb shook his head. I've got a ranch to run, cattle to tend, work that actually matters. I'm not interested in being anyone's poster child for reform. Mitchell looked disappointed but not surprised. What about you, Miss Hale? You're a writer. This could launch a significant career. Lenora thought about it. 6 months ago, she would have jumped at the chance. A real career, steady money, her name known across the territory. But standing there in Santa Fe, all she wanted was to get back to Iron Creek, back to the work of building something real instead of just writing about other people building things. I'll keep writing, she said, but I'll do it from home. They left Santa Fe the next morning, riding back toward Iron Creek through landscape that felt more familiar with every mile. Caleb visibly relaxed as the city disappeared behind them and open desert stretched ahead. You think we made a difference? He asked on the second day. I think we told the truth and some people listened. Whether that turns into actual change, that's not up to us anymore. Doesn't that bother you, doing all that work and then just walking away? We're not walking away, we're going back to do the real work. Let the politicians and lawyers handle the law. We'll handle the living. When they finally rode up to Iron Creek 5 days after leaving, Raphael was waiting on the porch with a grin that suggested good news. How'd it go? He called. We survived politicians, Caleb said, climbing down from his horse. Barely. Well, while you were gone, Morrison's eldest son asked if we'd teach him better water management techniques. The Becker family wants to partner with us on a cattle breeding program, and 3 newspapers sent telegrams asking for regular columns from Lenora. Anything actually go wrong? Lenora asked. One fence section went down in a storm. I fixed it. A coyote got a chicken, and the beans need harvesting. Raphael shrugged. Pretty quiet week, all things considered. They settled back into the rhythm of ranch work like they'd never left. But something felt different now. Easier somehow. Like they'd passed through the worst of something and come out the other side still intact. 2 weeks after returning from Santa Fe, Lenora was writing at the kitchen table when Caleb came in from outside and sat across from her. I've been thinking, he said. That's usually trouble. I'm serious. About what you said in that hearing. About women doing the same work deserving the same voice. You disagree? No, I'm saying you're right, and I'm saying this ranch should reflect that. He pulled out a piece of paper. A legal document of some kind. I had Mitchell draw this up before we left Santa Fe. It's a partnership agreement. Makes you a legal co-owner of Iron Creek. Equal say in all decisions. Equal share of profits and losses. Lenora stared at the document. Why would you do that? Because you've earned it. Because you've put as much into this place as I have over the last 6 months, and because if something happens to me, I don't want anyone questioning your right to stay here. He pushed the paper toward her. Also because I trust you, and I don't trust easily. Caleb, this is your ranch. You built it from nothing. I built the beginning of it, but what it's becoming, that's something we're building together. So either we're partners, or I'm lying to myself about what this is. Lenora picked up the document and read through it carefully. It was straightforward and fair, giving her actual legal standing instead of just being someone who worked there. If I sign this, I'm committed. Can't just leave if things get hard. I know. And people are going to talk. A man and woman running a ranch together, not married, that's going to cause gossip. Let them talk. I'm too old to care what people think. I'm not. But I'll deal with it. She looked at him across the table. This is really what you want? Yeah, it is. She signed the document and something fundamental shifted between them. Not just in legal terms, but in the way they moved through the world together. They were building something now, really building it. Not as employer and worker, not as man helping woman or woman helping man, but as equals choosing to create something neither could manage alone. The gossip Lenora predicted started almost immediately. Women in town whispered when she came in for supplies. Men made comments to Caleb about his arrangement. Even some of the neighboring ranchers who'd fought alongside them started asking pointed questions about what exactly was going on at Iron Creek. People think we're living in sin, Lenora told Raphael one evening while they were cooking. Are you? No, we're just working together. Then who cares what people think? Easy for you to say. You're not the one being called a woman of questionable morals. Raphael chopped vegetables and didn't look up. You know what I think? I think you care too much about what people say and not enough about what actually matters. You and Caleb built something real here. You saved this ranch. You're helping families across the territory. Why does it matter if some bored women in town want to invent scandals? Because reputations matter, especially for women. Reputations with who? People who've never done anything as brave as what you've done? He finally looked at her. You spent 2 years running from place to place because you didn't want to get hurt. Now you're here building something permanent and you're worried about gossip? That's just another way of running. Lenora opened her mouth to argue, then realized he was right. She was still looking for reasons to protect herself, still holding back from fully committing even after signing legal documents and publicly declaring she was staying. That night she found Caleb in the barn, checking on a cow that was close to calving. Raphael thinks I'm a coward, she said. Caleb didn't look up from examining the cow. What do you think? I think I'm scared. Of what? Of staying and having it not work out. Of building this life and then watching it fall apart. Of caring about all this too much and getting hurt when something goes wrong. Something will go wrong, that's guaranteed. He straightened up and looked at her. Drought will come again. Cattle will die. People will keep trying to take what we've built. That's just how life works out here. That's not reassuring. Not trying to reassure you. I'm trying to tell you the truth. He moved closer. You want to guarantee this will work out perfect? I can't give you that. Nobody can. But I can tell you that whatever goes wrong, we'll deal with it together. And I can tell you that I've never met anyone who fights as hard as you do for things that matter. I don't feel like I fight that hard. You rode into a territorial hearing and called powerful men corrupt to their faces. You organized a community to stand against armed men trying to steal land. You turned a ranch in the middle of nowhere into a symbol of resistance that people across the territory know about. He paused. You fight harder than anyone I've ever known. You just don't see it because you think fighting means not being afraid, but real fighting is being scared and doing it anyway. Lenora felt something loosen in her chest. When did you get so good at speeches? I'm not. I'm just telling you what I see. She stepped closer and kissed him. It wasn't planned or dramatic, just a simple acknowledgement of what had been building between them for months. When she pulled back, Caleb looked stunned. What was that for? He asked. For being honest. For making me a partner. For not trying to own me or change me or make me into something I'm not. She smiled. And because I wanted to. Well, he cleared his throat. All right then. That's all you've got to say? I'm still processing. She laughed, and it felt good. Like maybe she could do this after all. Maybe she could build a life here and risk caring about it and survive whatever came next. The cows started making distressed noises, and they spent the next 3 hours helping her deliver a calf that came out healthy and bawling. By the time they finished, it was past midnight, and they were both exhausted and covered in things they didn't want to think about too hard. "Welcome to the glamorous life of ranching," Caleb said, washing his hands in a bucket. "I've done worse." "Yeah, I guess you have." They walked back to the house together, and for the first time since arriving at Iron Creek 7 months ago, Lenora felt like she'd finally stopped running, like she'd found the place she was supposed to be, and the work she was supposed to do, and the person she was supposed to do it with. It wasn't perfect. The ranch still demanded brutal work. The drought would come again. People would keep testing them, but they'd face it together, and somehow that made all the difference. Spring arrived in 1884 with wildflowers Lenora had never seen before, brilliant yellows and deep purples spreading across the desert like someone had spilled paint. The drought had finally broken after 16 brutal months, and the land responded with a kind of desperate beauty, as if trying to make up for all the harshness that had come before. Caleb stood in the doorway one morning, watching the colors spread across the hills, and Lenora came to stand beside him with 2 cups of coffee. "Never seen it like this," he said quietly. "Is it always this way after drought?" "Sometimes, when the rain comes at the right time and the seeds are still viable in the soil, it's like the land was just waiting for permission to live again." They drank their coffee in silence, and Lenora thought about how much had changed since she'd arrived 9 months ago. The ranch had survived. They'd fought off Watts and his investors. The territorial reforms were slowly making their way through the legal system, and she'd signed partnership papers that made her legal co-owner of a place she'd once thought of as just temporary shelter. "Raphael wants to expand the vegetable garden," Caleb said. "Says with the water we've got and the rain that's coming, we could grow enough to sell surplus in town." "That's a good idea." "Yeah, but it means more work. We'd probably need to hire someone." "We've got the money now from selling the cattle we saved." "I know, just strange to think about bringing someone else in. It's been the 3 of us for so long." Lenore understood what he meant. Iron Creek had become something specific, a place built by 3 people who trusted each other completely. Adding someone new would change that dynamic, even if it was necessary. "We'll find the right person," she said. "Someone who understands what we're building here." A week later, a young woman named Sarah Chen showed up looking for work. She was the daughter of the rancher who'd organized families to come defend Iron Creek during the standoff, and she'd spent the last year helping her father's ranch survive the drought. Now she wanted to learn more about sustainable ranching practices and water management. "My father says you know more about making things grow in dry conditions than anyone else in the territory," she told Caleb during the interview. "I want to learn from people who've actually done it, instead of just reading about it in some agricultural journal written by men back east who've never seen a real drought." Caleb looked at Lenora, who was trying not to smile. The girl reminded her of herself, determined and tired of being dismissed. "You ever worked a ranch before?" Caleb asked. "My whole life. I can ride, rope, mend fence, treat sick cattle, and I'm better at fixing irrigation systems than my father's foreman." She paused. "And I can shoot if that matters." "Why would that matter?" "Because I heard what happened here with those men trying to steal your land. I heard you had to defend it. So I figure if I'm going to work somewhere, I want to work somewhere worth defending." They hired her on the spot. Sarah fit into the ranch like she'd always been there. She worked harder than anyone expected, asked smart questions, and had a practical turn of mind that made solving problems easier. Within a month, she'd reorganized the barn, improved the irrigation system, and convinced Raphael to try planting crops they'd never considered before. "She's good," Raphael told Lenora one evening while they were cooking. "Reminds me of you when you first got here. Same kind of hungry to prove something." "I wasn't trying to prove anything." "Yes, you were. You were trying to prove you could stay somewhere and not have it fall apart. That you could build instead of just survive." He stirred the pot on the stove. "She's trying to prove women can run ranches as well as men. Maybe better." "Think she's right?" "I think she's going to get a chance to find out. Her father's not getting any younger, and her brother's left for California. Someone's got to take over that ranch eventually." The partnership agreement Lenora had signed with Caleb became public knowledge in town after someone at the territorial office mentioned it to a reporter. The gossip intensified from whispers to open speculation about the exact nature of their relationship. One afternoon in town, a woman Lenora barely knew stopped her outside the general store. "Miss Hale, I hope you don't mind me saying, but people are talking." "Let them talk. It's just that you and Mr. Mercer running that ranch together, not married. Well, it gives a certain impression." Lenora set down the supplies she was carrying and looked at the woman directly. "What impression is that exactly?" "That you're living in a way that's not proper." "I'm living in a way that keeps a ranch running and a community supplied with water. If that's not proper, then proper doesn't mean much out here." "But surely you understand how it looks." "I understand that people will always find something to judge if they're looking for it. I also understand that Mr. Mercer made me a legal partner in a business I've helped build, which is more than most men would do. So if folks want to invent scandals because a woman owns property and works alongside men, that says more about them than it does about me." The woman's face flushed. "I was only trying to help. I don't need that kind of help. But thank you for the concern." When Lenora got back to the ranch and told Caleb about the encounter, he looked more amused than bothered. "Wondered how long before someone said something directly," he said. "What do you want to do about it?" "About gossip? Nothing. Let them talk until they get bored and find someone else to speculate about." "Or," Caleb said carefully, "we could give them something real to talk about instead of letting them make things up." Lenora looked at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we should get married." The words hung in the air between them. It wasn't a romantic proposal, no kneeling, no pretty speech, just a practical suggestion delivered in the same tone he might use to discuss fence repairs. "That's the worst proposal I've ever heard," Lenora said. "It wasn't really a proposal, more like a suggestion." "Well, it's a terrible suggestion if the only reason is to stop gossip." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's not the only reason. I'm just bad at saying the rest of it out loud." "Try." He looked uncomfortable, like a man being forced to explain something he thought should be obvious. "I trust you more than I've trusted anyone. I like working alongside you. I like talking to you at the end of long days. I like that you're not afraid to tell me when I'm being stubborn or stupid. And I like that when I think about the future of this place, you're in every version of it I can imagine." He paused. "That's not marriage material, I know. You probably want someone who says prettier things, but it's the truth." Lenora felt her throat tighten. "That's better than pretty things. Pretty things don't mean much when you're hauling water in August." "So is that a yes?" "It's a, let me think about it, bud." She thought about it for 3 days. Not because she wasn't sure. She was sure the moment he'd said she was in every version of his future. But because she wanted to make certain she was choosing this for the right reasons. Not to stop gossip, not because it was expected, but because she wanted to build a life with this man who'd given her water when she was dying and space when she needed it, and partnership when she'd earned it. On the 4th day, she found him mending fence in the north pasture. "Yes," she said. He looked up from his work. "Yes, what?" "Yes, I'll marry you. But not because of gossip and not because it's proper. Because I want to." Caleb set down his tools and stood. "When?" "Soon. No big ceremony, just us and Raphael and Sarah as witnesses. And we do it here by the spring, not in some church in town where everyone can stare and judge." "That works for me." They married on a Sunday morning in late May beneath the cottonwoods beside the spring. Raphael stood as witness along with Sarah and Morrison, who'd ridden over when he heard what was happening. The ceremony was conducted by a traveling minister who asked almost no questions and seemed relieved they weren't asking for anything elaborate. Lenora wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself from fabric she'd bought in town. Caleb wore his cleanest work clothes and looked uncomfortable but present in a way that mattered more than appearance. They exchanged vows that were short and honest, promises to work together, support each other, and build something that would last. There was no talk of obeying or submitting, just partnership and commitment, and choosing each other despite knowing all the ways it could go wrong. After the ceremony, Raphael produced a bottle of good whiskey he'd been saving, and they all drank to the future while the spring ran steady beside them. "So now you're Mrs. Mercer," Sarah said, smiling. "I'm keeping Hale for my writing," Lenora said. "But yes, legally I'm Mrs. Mercer now." "How does it feel?" "Exactly the same as yesterday, except Now there's paperwork, Sarah laughed. That's the most practical thing I've ever heard about marriage. That night, lying beside Caleb in the darkness of their room, Lenora thought about how strange it was that getting married felt less like a dramatic change and more like acknowledging what had already been true for months. They'd been partners before the ceremony. They'd been committed before the vows. The legal recognition just made visible what they'd been building all along. "You awake?" Caleb asked. "Yeah." "You happy?" "I think so. Are you?" "Yeah, I think I am." They lay in comfortable silence, and Lenora realized that happiness wasn't the dramatic feeling she'd expected. It was quieter than that, more solid, like the difference between a flash flood and a spring that never stopped running. The territorial reforms finally passed in July, after months of political fighting. Mitchell sent a telegram with the news, along with a note saying the Iron Creek case had been crucial in swaying enough votes to make it happen. New laws now required independent verification of land surveys, mandatory notification to property owners when cases were filed against their land, and federal oversight of water rights. "We did that," Raphael said, reading the telegram over Lenora's shoulder. "All of us together." "We started it," Lenora corrected. "Other people finished it." "Still counts." She wrote an article about the reforms for the papers that still published her work. But she also wrote about what the reforms meant for real people. Families who could now fight back against fraud. Ranchers who had actual legal protection. Communities that could organize around shared water resources without fear of losing everything. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from across the territory and beyond. People writing to say the reforms had saved their ranches. Lawyers asking how to apply the new laws in specific cases. Other territories requesting information about how New Mexico had made such significant changes. "You're famous now," Caleb said one evening, watching her sort through the latest batch of letters. "I'm known. That's different." "How?" "Famous means people care about you because of who you are. Known means people care about what you've done." "I prefer the second one." The ranch continued growing. They expanded the cattle operation carefully, never pushing past what the land could sustain. They brought in more families to the water sharing agreement, eventually organizing it into a proper cooperative with written bylaws and elected leadership. They hired 2 more workers, both women who'd left situations where their labor wasn't valued and who wanted to learn from a ranch where women could own property and make decisions. By autumn of 1884, Iron Creek had become something more than just a ranch. It was a proving ground for sustainable practices, a model for cooperative resource management, and a symbol that had meaning beyond its actual size. People visited from across the territory to see how they managed water, how they organized labor, how they'd built something that worked when so many others had failed. Lenora documented all of it. She wrote about the practical aspects, the irrigation techniques, the breeding programs, the crop rotation strategies. But she also wrote about the philosophy behind it, about the difference between exploitation and stewardship, about how survival in harsh conditions required cooperation more than competition, about how the strongest communities were built by people who understood that their success depended on their neighbors' success too. One evening in late October, a young reporter from Denver showed up asking to interview Lenora about her work. "Your articles have been widely read," he said, sitting at the kitchen table with his notebook open. "People are calling you the voice of the frontier woman. How does that feel?" "Like a simplification," Lenora said honestly. "I write about what I see. Other women are living these stories. I'm just putting words to them. But you're doing more than documenting. You're advocating for change, for women's rights, for land reform, for sustainable practices. That's activism, not just journalism." "Maybe. But activism without action is just talk. The real work happens here, in the daily decisions about how to treat land and water and people. The writing just helps other people see what's possible." "Do you think women will ever have the same opportunities as men in the territory?" Lenora thought about that. "I think opportunities don't get given, they get taken. Women have been doing the same work as men on ranches and farms for as long as anyone's been out here. The only difference is whether that work gets recognized and compensated fairly." She paused. "Will things change?" "Yes, but slowly. And only because women keep pushing and refusing to accept that their labor matters less than men's." The reporter scribbled notes furiously. "And your husband supports this view?" My husband made me a legal partner in this ranch before he married me. He understands that strong partnerships require equality, not hierarchy. But you should ask him yourself instead of assuming I speak for him." Caleb, who'd been sitting quietly on the other side of the room, spoke up. "She's right, about all of it. I'm not some enlightened man doing women a favor by treating them fairly. I'm just a man who figured out that good work deserves recognition regardless of who does it. And I'm smart enough to know that Lenora makes this ranch better in ways I never could alone." The article that came out of that interview ran in papers across Colorado and New Mexico. It featured both of them, but focused heavily on Lenora's writing and activism. Within weeks, she received offers from publishers wanting her to write a book about frontier life and women's experiences in the territory. "You gonna do it?" Raphael asked when she showed him one of the offers. "I don't know. Writing a book feels so permanent, like I'm claiming to be an expert when I'm still figuring everything out myself." "You've been figuring things out while writing about them for over a year now. That's how most experts start." "Maybe. But there's a difference between writing articles about specific situations and claiming to speak for all frontier women." "Then don't claim to speak for everyone. Just tell your story and let other people see themselves in it." She thought about that for days. Finally, she wrote back to one of the publishers with a proposal. She'd write a book, but it would be structured as a series of portraits. Different women across the territory, their stories woven together to show the diversity of frontier experiences. She'd include her own story, but not as the center, just as one voice among many. The publisher agreed, and Lenora spent the next 6 months traveling across New Mexico, interviewing women. Ranch wives who'd built businesses alongside their husbands, widows who'd taken over operations when their men died, single women who'd homesteaded alone, Native women who'd watched their traditional lands get carved up and sold, Mexican women whose families had been in the territory for generations but were treated as newcomers by Anglo settlers. She collected stories that were hard and honest and complicated, stories about survival and loss and strength that didn't look like the romanticized versions people back east wanted to hear. And she wrote them all down with the same careful attention she'd brought to her articles about Iron Creek. The work took her away from the ranch more than she liked, and every time she left, she worried that something crucial would fall apart in her absence. But Caleb, Raphael, and Sarah managed everything smoothly, proving that the systems they'd built were strong enough to survive without her constant presence. "This is what partnership means," Caleb told her one night when she expressed guilt about being gone so much. "We hold things together so you can do the work that matters beyond this ranch. That's not you abandoning us. That's us supporting what you're building." By summer of 1885, 2 years after Lenore had arrived at Iron Creek dying of thirst, the book was finished. She titled it Springs That Don't Run Dry: Women Building Lives in the New Mexico Territory. The publisher printed 5,000 copies initially, expecting modest sales to a regional audience. They sold out in 6 weeks. The book resonated with people across the country. Women wrote to say they'd seen themselves in the stories. Men wrote to say the book had changed how they thought about frontier labor and women's contributions. Newspapers reviewed it favorably. Academic journals cited it as important documentation of Western expansion from perspectives that had been largely ignored. And suddenly, Lenora Hale Mercer was more than just a regional writer. She was someone whose work mattered on a national scale. The attention was overwhelming. Publishers wanted more books. Magazines wanted regular columns. Women's organizations wanted her to speak at conferences. The territorial governor asked her to join a commission on land use and water rights. "You could do all of this," Caleb said when she laid out the various offers. "Go to these conferences, write these books, join these commissions. The ranch would survive. We'd manage. But I don't want to just be someone who writes about building things while other people actually build them. I want to be here doing the work." "Then do both. The writing matters, Lenora. It changes how people think about this place and these issues. But that doesn't mean you have to choose between writing and living the life you write about." She negotiated compromises. She'd write one book every 2 years, not one every year. She'd speak at one major conference annually, not every conference that invited her. She'd contribute to commissions and policy work remotely when possible, traveling only when her physical presence was crucial. And the rest of the time, she'd be at Iron Creek doing the work that had always mattered most. The ranch continued evolving. By 1886, they'd expanded to employ 8 people full-time, all of them women who wanted to learn sustainable ranching practices. They'd helped establish 6 similar cooperative water systems across the territory. They documented and published best practices for drought management that were being used by ranchers from Texas to California. Iron Creek had become what Caleb had hoped for when he first bought the land. Something that lasted. Something that mattered. Something that helped more people than just those who lived there. On a cool evening in October 1886, Lenora sat on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the horizon while Caleb worked on repairing a saddle beside her. Raphael and Sarah were in town getting supplies. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. The spring ran steady and strong through the heart of the land, just as it always had. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Caleb asked, not looking up from his work. "Different how? If you died in the desert before you found this place? If I'd turned you away that first day? If Watts had succeeded in taking the ranch? If the reforms hadn't passed? Any of those things go differently, and we're not sitting here now." Lenora thought about that. About all the moments when everything could have fallen apart but didn't. About the luck and timing and sheer stubborn determination that had carried them through. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted, "but I try not to dwell on the paths we didn't take. This is the one we're on. This is the life we built. That's what matters. You happy with it?" "Most days. Some days are still hard. The work never stops being brutal. The weather still tries to kill everything we plant. People still test whether we're strong enough to defend what we've built." She paused. "But yeah, I'm happy with it. Are you?" Caleb set down the saddle and looked at her. "Happier than I thought I'd ever be. And that's because of you. It's because of both of us. And Raphael, and everyone who's helped along the way. True? But mostly you." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the desert, and Lenora thought about how happiness wasn't something you found or achieved. It was something you built slowly through thousands of small decisions about how to live and who to trust and what to fight for. She'd spent her whole adult life running from places that hurt her, convinced that the next town or job would somehow be different. But the answer wasn't finding a place that didn't hurt. The answer was finding a place worth fighting for, even when it did. Iron Creek had hurt her. The work was brutal. The summers were devastating. The winters were harsh. The constant uncertainty about water and weather and markets wore her down. She'd been tested physically, emotionally, and legally. She'd made enemies and struggled with doubt and questioned whether staying was worth the cost. But she'd also found work that mattered, partnership that was real, a community that supported each other, and a man who saw her clearly and valued her anyway. That night, lying beside Caleb after they'd both finally stopped working for the day, Lenora thought about the woman who'd ridden up to this ranch 3 years ago. That woman had been running from grief, from failure, from the fear of staying anywhere long enough to watch it fall apart. This woman wasn't running anymore. "You know what I realized today?" she said quietly into the darkness. "What's that?" "For the first time in years, I'm not thinking about the next place. I'm just here. Actually, here. Planning for next season's crops and thinking about expanding the barn and wondering whether we should get more cattle next spring. Normal things, permanent things." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That scare you?" "No, not anymore." Over the next several years, Iron Creek continued to grow in influence, even as it stayed roughly the same size physically. Lenora wrote 2 more books documenting frontier life and water management. The reforms they'd fought for became standard practice across Western territories. The cooperative model they'd helped establish spread to communities facing similar challenges. But more than that, they built something that lasted not just in legal terms, but in human terms. Sarah eventually took over her father's ranch and implemented everything she'd learned at Iron Creek. The women who'd worked there went on to run their own operations or become advisors to other ranches struggling with drought conditions. The children who grew up drinking from the spring went on to become territorial officials, lawyers, water engineers, people who carried forward the idea that survival required cooperation and sustainability rather than exploitation. Lenora kept writing until her hands got too stiff with arthritis to hold a pen easily. Even then, she dictated stories to younger writers who wanted to learn from her. She documented changes in the territory as it moved from frontier chaos towards something more organized. She watched towns grow and railroads arrive and the old patterns of life shift into new configurations. Caleb kept working the land until his body finally told him to slow down. Even then, he consulted with neighboring ranchers and taught younger generations how to read weather patterns and manage resources. He watched the ranch he'd built from nothing become something bigger than himself, a model that influenced practices across multiple territories and eventually states. Raphael stayed at Iron Creek his entire life, becoming the keeper of institutional knowledge about the land and the spring and all the small practices that made survival possible. He trained dozens of young workers and made sure the cooperative principles they'd established stayed central even as operations expanded. On a warm spring afternoon many years later, when Lenora was in her 60s and the American West had changed almost beyond recognition from the frontier she'd first encountered, she sat on the same porch where she'd spent so many evenings and looked out at land that was simultaneously familiar and transformed. The spring still ran. That was what mattered most. Through droughts and floods, through territorial changes and statehood, through economic booms and busts, the spring had never stopped flowing. And because it hadn't stopped, the community built around it had survived and grown. Young women came to visit sometimes, reporters or students or activists who'd read her books and wanted to meet the woman who'd documented so much frontier history. They asked about her work, her writing, her activism. They wanted to know how she'd managed to build a career and a life in a time and place that didn't want women doing either. Lenora always told them the same thing. I didn't manage anything, I just kept working, kept writing, kept pushing when people said I should stop. And I found people, a few good people, who valued work over gender and results over tradition. That's all. Nothing heroic about it, just stubbornness and luck and refusing to accept that my labor mattered less than anyone else's. But you changed things, they'd insist. The reforms, the cooperative models, the books, all of that mattered. Maybe, but the real changes happen in small moments. Every time a woman got paid fairly for her work, every time a community chose cooperation over competition, every time someone looked at land and water and thought about sustainability instead of exploitation. Those small moments, thousands of them happening across the territory, that's what actually changed things. I just documented it. The truth was more complicated than that, and Lenora knew it. Her work had mattered. Her writing had influenced policy and changed minds and given voice to perspectives that had been ignored. But she also knew that making herself the center of the story would be a betrayal of everything she'd tried to document. The frontier hadn't been built by heroes. It had been built by thousands of people doing hard work in difficult conditions, most of them unnamed and unrecognized. She just happened to be one of the people who wrote their stories down. One evening, sitting with Caleb on the porch while the sun set and the spring ran its endless course through the heart of the land, she tried to put it all into words. "You know what I think matters most about what we built here?" she asked. "What's that?" "It's that we proved something doesn't have to be perfect to be good. This ranch, it's had hard years and failures and times when we barely made it through. We've made mistakes, pushed too hard sometimes, not pushed hard enough others. The cooperative has had conflicts. The reforms didn't fix everything. My books didn't tell every story that needed telling." She paused, watching the light fade across the desert. "But we built something that lasted anyway, something that helped people despite its imperfections. And I think that matters more than any perfect thing we might have imagined but never actually created." Caleb nodded slowly. "You're saying done is better than perfect. I'm saying human is better than perfect. Perfect things don't exist except in imagination. But human things, flawed, struggling, imperfect human things, those can be real. Those can matter." They sat in comfortable silence while darkness settled around them, and Lenora thought about all the ways life had surprised her. She'd come to this place expecting to die. Instead, she'd learned how to live. Really live, not just survive. She'd learned that home wasn't something you found, but something you built with your own hands, and the help of people who became family through choice rather than blood. She'd learned that strength wasn't about never being afraid. It was about being afraid and staying anyway. About fighting for things that might fail but fighting anyway, because the alternative was giving up before you'd even tried. She'd learned that the most important stories weren't about dramatic victories or perfect endings. They were about ordinary people doing extraordinarily hard work under impossible conditions and somehow finding ways to keep going. And she'd learned that the springs that mattered most, the ones that sustained life through drought and hardship, were the ones that ran steady rather than fast, that kept flowing year after year without drama or fanfare, that you could count on when everything else failed. As she sat there beside the man she'd chosen, and the land they'd fought for, and the spring that had never stopped running, Lenora understood something fundamental about survival. It wasn't about being the strongest or the smartest or the luckiest. It was about showing up day after day to do the work that mattered, even when you weren't sure it would be enough. And somehow, against all odds, it had been enough. The spring kept running, the land kept yielding, the work kept mattering, and the life they'd built together, imperfect and difficult and real, kept proving that the hardest things were often the most worth doing. That was the truth she'd carry with her until the end. Not that everything worked out perfectly, not that hard work guaranteed success, but that choosing to stay and fight and build alongside people you trusted was its own kind of victory, regardless of how the story ended. And for them, sitting together on the porch they'd built beside the spring that never ran dry, that victory was enough.